This show was previously broadcast live on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com.
Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Expanding Mind, where we're looking at the contemporary culture of consciousness, spirituality, technology, psychoactives, and our weird world. All of these things covered. Well, one of the weirdnesses of our world is that conspiracy theory over the last 10, 15 years has really taken off. Conspiracy theory has been a part of our culture for a long time. There's a famous argument that there's a fundamentally paranoid strain in American politics, and so you find a lot of fantasies about outside manipulation and dark groups working behind the scenes. But since the onset of the Internet, with its cornucopia of conspiracies, and especially in the wake of 9/11, we've really seen an upswelling of discussions of nefarious deeds and dark secret societies pulling our puppet strings behind the surface of things. And one of the groups that you're going to find mentioned in these conspiracies over and over and over again, and this has been true for quite a long time, are the Freemasons. Even if you just say the word Freemason, I'm sure everyone out there in Radioland has a bunch of images pop up in their head of, eyes and pyramids and fellows in weird garb meeting in secret rooms and strange rites and whispered words and secret signs and something about politics and something about global government and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's no way to think about the Freemasons without encountering this thick web of imagination, of projection and association and rumor and whisper. It's almost like a key node, like JFK, for conspiracy thinking and all the imaginative and sometimes paranoid work that goes on under the idea of conspiracy thinking. Today's guest is Kinney, and he wrote a new book about Masonry called The Masonic Myth, and we'll be bringing Jay on in a second. But I wanted to introduce the co-host of Expanding Mind, our esoteric librarian, Maja Daou. Maja, are you frightened of the Freemasons in any way?
Fear is a mind killer, Erik, so I try not to be scared of anything. But, it's funny. I work at the Philosophical Research Society, and, of course, Manly Hall has written many books on Freemasonry, so we get a lot of the conspiracy type of folks that come in the library, and they think that Manly Hall was like Illuminati, or that there's going to be, like, some vault of Egyptian gold in the library somewhere, like they saw a national treasure, and then everyone comes and like freaks out on Freemasons. So I have to deal with that type of thing a lot. I don't know if you yourself get confronted with that sort of thing, but I definitely do.
Well, it's actually interesting. I mean, I've been fascinated by esoteric systems and mysticism and secret societies, et cetera, for many years, for decades, and yet I realized that I actually didn't really have a very good understanding of Freemasonry at all, because any time that I would start to read a book about it, I could tell that it was one of these books that fuses fact and imagination, and which can be really fun. I mean, that's the thing. If you're interested in esoteric matters, there's this whole subset of the literature that is almost a kind of science fiction in the guise of history or the guise of expose, where people go in and they tell you the truth about some subaltern group like the Knights Templar or the Rennes la Chateau, and it's kind of fun. I mean, it's sort of like there's a certain kind of pleasure to this literature that's kind of like fantasy novels, but it's also kind of like weird underground newspapers and broadsheets and paranoid conspiracy theory websites, and there's a whole realm of like fantasy fused with fact
Well, it's true, and I think it's because the Freemasons are a kind of secret organization, so when all the information is not revealed, then people's imaginations literally run wild.
Yeah, I over and over again I come to this about how much with the occult stuff and mysticism in general, how important this role of the imagination is. Both in terms of how people see it from the outside, in the sense that they're projecting ideas onto these mysteries or to these other groups, and those projections, those imaginations have a lot of power. But it's also the case that a lot of these groups, a lot of occult systems, a lot of mystery religions, a lot of traditions use that same power of the imagination and secrecy. There's something about the power of secrecy itself that helps kind of charge the situation.
That's very true, I think.
Well, I want to, but in any case, that's one of the reasons I was so happy to read Jay Kinney's book, because, amidst this exploding library of, shoddy, sometimes fascinating, quote unquote, scholarship or nonfiction books on Masonry, his book is really a very clear, sober, funny, down to earth, and very intelligent overview of what it's really about in all its sort of, in many ways, kind of ordinary details about institutional organizations and history and what actually goes on in rituals. Not with the specifics. He's maintaining his own kind of code of silence around certain matters. But in any case, it's a breath of fresh air, and I'm really happy to bring Jay Kinney onto Expanding Mind. Thanks for showing up, Jay.
Well, thank you for having me.
Great. So, I wanted to just start out a little bit with you, because it's interesting. You're very upfront that you are Mason. You joined Freemasonry, relatively recently, and this is partly what led you to do the research for the book. So, could you talk a little bit about how you got into Masonry and how that led to the idea of the book?
Sure. As some people may know, I used to publish a magazine devoted to esoteric traditions, Gnosis magazine. I did that for 15 years. And each issue of Gnosis was devoted to a different topic in the wide range of Western esoterica. And one of our issues, I think around 97, was on Freemasonry. We took that as the topic for the issue. And that allowed me to sort of plunge more deeply into that topic. We got a number of writers who were covering it from different angles. And so that really particularly piqued my curiosity. And then once we had to lay the magazine to rest in 1999, my schedule opened up, and I thought, well, maybe now's a good time to actually investigate Masonry, try it out, see what it's all about from the inside. And so around 2000, I started making inquiries and did a lot of research on the internet to begin with to get an idea of what I was going to get into. And then I contacted some Masons in the area, one of whom had written for that issue of Gnosis, done the lead article, and another one who was a friend of a friend, and went by their lodge, which was in Mill Valley in Marin County, a lovely old 100-year-old building with a great lodge room that had probably been unchanged in 100 years. And I liked what I saw. I liked talking with these guys, and I met several more from the lodge. And I thought, well, this doesn't look scary at all. It looks fairly upfront. So I applied to join, and I started getting the degrees at the beginning of 2001. So it's been 8.5 years since I was initiated, and I was raised to a Master Mason in June of 2001, just a few months before 9/11 sort of threw us all for a loop ever since.
Yeah, I want to ask you, since you were, I know editing Gnosis magazine and just in your own interest, there's many different spiritual paths and traditions that you've been interested in, East and West, Islam, many different strains within Western esotericism. What was it about Masonry at that point in your life that attracted you?
Well, one of the reasons that Gnosis magazine ultimately went under was that I think the readership was kind of splintered among a lot of different interests, and one issue would sell well, but another issue would just fall flat because there weren't enough people interested in that. And I thought, well, maybe we were trying to spread ourselves too thin. And when we laid the magazine to rest, I thought, there seems to be one organization that's sort of been the caretaker of the esoteric, that's been well organized, that's involved millions of people, and maybe that would be a good support group, a good home for me to pursue my research, my ongoing interests. So that was part of my thinking. Now, of course, when I actually joined, I discovered that any previous image I had of what it was really like needed to be refreshed with the reality of it.
Did you find there was esoteric support in the group?
What I found was that there were quite a few individual Masons, a number of whom had been readers of Gnosis. They sort of came out of the woodwork when I became a Mason. And Masonry is one of its services, if you want to call it that, is that it does bring together men from a whole variety of backgrounds. And among those variety are some Masons who are interested in esoteric spirituality and the esoteric traditions. So within Masonry, there are Masons who find each other and encourage each other, sort of egg each other on to do research in these things. I would say that modern Masonry on the whole, as a institution, it sort of gives a nod in the direction of the esoterica, and it sort of allows its members to pursue their interest in that. It doesn't forbid them from it particularly. Mm-hmm. But at the Grand Lodge level, at the level of the administrators, they don't particularly have a position one way or the other.
But one of the great things about your book, and I really, highly recommend anybody who's been interested or fascinated or intrigued by the Masons to check it out, is precisely the experience of watching one's own unacknowledged fantasies about this group sort of dissolve in the light of what is in largely a more mundane reality, in the sense that you're talking about an institution that has organization that moves through history and splinters and develops bureaucracies, and within which more ordinary sorts of social engagement occurs. And yet, once you've gone through that, once you've sort of let go of these myths, which I want to talk about in a second, just because it's good to get them out in the open, but the big stories about Masonry, you kind of burn through those, and it's kind of funny to watch them go. But then at the end, there's something that's much more substantial that still has some of that mystery in it. There's still something that, even if for a lot of Masons they're not as interested in the more mystical sides or the deeper possible interpretations of all this amazing symbolism and the sort of mystical or psycho-spiritual metaphors that are manifested in these rituals, that nonetheless there's a real core there that feels very authentic. I mean, was that something that came to you, a lot over time? Was it really through your own experience, or also through studying more about the reality of Masonry through your access to their libraries and such?
Well, I sort of went through stages. For the first couple of years, when I was first initiated and involved with my local lodge, I was hyper enthusiastic. It was almost as if I had converted to a new way of life or something. And there was a lot of exciting nooks and crannies to explore, a lot of additional sort of sub-organizations within Masonry that were inviting me to join them. I probably joined too many. I sort of overextended myself. But, there was all sorts of things that are there in Masonic libraries and in Masonic research, most of which isn't available to the general public. I mean, it's not secret. It's just not distributed in a way that people would run into it. It's mostly in Masonic libraries. So a lot of that was, I don't know, it was very compelling. Then I got into a stage where the sort of realities of the organizational structure of my fellow Masons were hard to ignore. And that was, it's an organization of everyday men, and even though our ideals within Masonry are universal brotherhood, a sort of egalitarian, we're all on the same level philosophy, inevitably in any organization you've got, power plays, you've got politicking, you've got, some guy that's a large frog in a small pond and throwing his weight around. And that sort of got to me for a while, and I got fairly cynical about it. But then I sort of passed beyond that phase and had a sort of more balanced view of it, and that was that all these things coexist simultaneously. The esoteric is there, the totally exoteric, the fascinating, and the utterly boring. They coexist simultaneously within Masonry, and what I tried to do in the book was to sort of take the reader through the reality of it, make it interesting as they're journeying along, sort of figuring out the various mysteries about what Masons do and what's with all these fancy names for different officers and things like that. And, show that at its core there is still an authentic transformative process that Masonry encourages, even though I would say that some of its leaders, I think, are not especially aware of that, or they are on a sort of surface level. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the myths, though, just because that's such a, in our world today with the Dan Brown stuff and conspiracy theory and Jay-Z and his, music videos, that there's this kind of ambient world of sort of inchoate images of Masonry. Can you talk a little bit about what the major ones are and even a little where they come from?
Well, there's the political accusations that the Masons are an arm of the Illuminati, that they're holding the levers of world power, that behind the scenes powerful politicians and judges and bankers and what have you are all Masons, and therefore they've got a leg up on everybody else. And, I think that perception or that rumor stems largely originally from both the 1700s, because undeniably Masonry, or at least Masons, not Masonry institutionally, but individual Masons, did play a role in the American Revolution. Paul Revere was a very active Freemason. George Washington was a Mason for many decades. He was perhaps less active, but nevertheless it was part of his life. And Benjamin Franklin definitely was an active Mason for many years. And so you have the ideas that Masonry in the 1700s was upholding. I mean, at that time, the very idea of universal brotherhood across religious lines, across class lines, across political lines, that was basically a revolutionary idea, and it really sort of shook up the establishment of its day. And you had the Catholic Church, which was, holding on to its political power on the continent. The popes condemned Masonry. They sort of felt like it was...
well, they said it was satanic, right, in the papal bull?
Well, yeah, but, I think for them, anything that wasn't approved by them was satanic. Right. Sort of there's a catch-22 there.
Right.
I don't think there's components within Masonry itself that are anywhere near anything you could call satanic, but that accusation is just a favorite one, both of the traditional Catholic Church, but also these days of the fundamentalists, whether it's Christians or Muslims or whatever. Anything that they don't like that doesn't parrot back to them their own worldview, it must be the tool of Satan. So anyway, I think there was a time when Masonry did have a worldview that was considered revolutionary. Then in the course of the 1800s and the 1900s, I think that evolved. It became much more sort of normalized, integrated within everyday civil society, and that political phase, particularly in the United States, I think largely, faded back. But there was this one incident early on in the 1800s, in 1826, the William Morgan affair, where a disaffected Mason threatened to publish the secret rituals of the degrees of Masonry. And he was in upstate New York, which at that time was sort of on the frontier, pushing west in the United States. And the way I view it is that you had all these sort of not terribly well-educated country Masons who got really irate over this guy's going to reveal our rituals. Let's get him, So William Morgan disappears, and basically, seemingly, it was a bunch of cranked-up Masons who took him either across the border to Canada and told him to get lost, or took him out into a lake and pushed him out of a boat, or whatever it was. It sort of exploded into this enormous scandal, and rightly so. I mean, that was totally unforgivable. I think those guys that did it, or seemingly did it, did not fully understand their own vows as Masons. So,
would you say that's an isolated incident, that Freemasons in general would not retaliate against someone who was threatening to release the secrets, or do you think
precisely,
that's something...
because, the funny thing is that since 1731, something like that, the rituals of Masonry, its secret signs and words and whatnot, have been repeatedly published, in things called exposures. Mm-hmm. And, it's what Morgan was threatening to publish had been published numerous times already without anybody getting killed or even anybody really getting annoyed. So, in fact, the only way that many Masons know their own history is due to these exposures, because otherwise the rituals were all an oral tradition. They were memorized and passed on from person to person. So
let's talk about secrecy a little bit more, just because it's such a fascinating thing. I mean, what you're saying here, it shows the way that we need secrecy for reasons that we're maybe not always aware of. I mean, both people on the outside and on the inside. I mean, there's a really interesting part of your book where you start to meditate on the sense of secrecy and the role of secrecy in Freemasonry, pointing out that, of course, a lot of these things that we think are secrets are actually available to someone with some diligence in research, but that there are still secrets. And one aspect of it is just that there's some kind of inherent power of secrecy within an organization, that it almost doesn't matter what the secret is. It's just a way of organizing rituals and information to create a social situation that can be transformative. Talk a little bit about that role of secrecy just as a function itself within esoteric organizations.
Okay. Well, I think a component of most esoteric traditions has been that a member or initiate within that tradition is counseled to maintain his silence about his own inner work. If you're always blabbing about, I just had this great mystical experience, or this is what we did today. It just makes it totally mundane. It sort of brings it in the realm of gossip and common everyday joking that gets batted around. Whereas if you keep a lid on your own experiences, then they can sort of build internally, and there's a certain internal pressure. I think that is a positive thing in terms of your own growth and transformation. So I think that's been a component there with most esoteric traditions. Within Masonry, in addition, what I think you have is you're creating a kind of sacred space within the lodge room. It's not the sacred space in the sense of, you're in a church or you're at the church altar or something like that, but it's a sacred psychological space where you're within this lodge room. The rest of the world is out there. It's the mundane world, the everyday business world. You're putting it out of your mind, and within the lodge room, particularly when the degree rituals are being performed, it really helps to have this sacred space where it's all focused, the energy that people are bringing to putting on the ritual, because it's all memorized. All the officers who are talking their parts are doing it from memory. In some cases, they're delivering 20-minute lectures all from memory, which is sort of mind-boggling when you witness it. I think that for somebody undergoing that initiation, having that sacred space, having that the realm of the lodge room, where there is secrecy, you don't want somebody walking in off the street in the middle of the ritual. You've got somebody sort of guarding the lodge room door. It just makes for a much better experience, and that definitely was the case for me when I underwent the degrees. So
would you say then that the secrecy is more for the sake of preserving that sacred space than from, keeping secrets from the world or doing, God knows what satanic ritual?
Yeah.
I just want to make it clear that...
that's my take on it, that it is maintaining the sacred space. Mm-hmm. Most Masons wouldn't necessarily say it in those terms. That's not necessarily a concept that they're consciously working with. There is the other factor, and this looms large in a lot of Masons' understanding of why there are secrets, and that is you're taking a vow or an obligation with each degree to maintain the secrets of Masonry. And that's viewed generally as, okay, this is a matter of your willpower. You're training your willpower to, do your bidding, to not just sort of blab out the first thing that comes to your mind, and have something that you are keeping private with the other brothers. Now, as it turns out, they don't define very well what those secrets are that you're supposed to maintain, and the consensus basically is, at this point, the secrets that you're duty-bound to maintain are the modes of recognition between Masons, the handshakes, the signs, sort of hand gestures that are made in association with each degree, and the words, the passwords for each degree, and then the specific wording of the ritual. You can discuss, components of the ritual, which I do in my book, but I don't get into specific wording because, again, particularly if somebody's reading the book and is interested in becoming a Mason but hasn't made an application yet, I don't want to just totally blow the whole thing for them. A big part of the impact of a ritual such as the Masonic ones, is an element of freshness, of surprise. So I think that's part of it as well. But the modes of recognition, the reason for that secrecy goes back to the old stonemasons, the medieval guilds, and the Masonic stonemasons lodges. And they're basically protecting trade secrets.
I'm glad you brought that up, too, because I think another air of mystery around the Masons is in their origin stories, like with, Egypt and the pyramids and Hiram Abiff and all of these amazing, fantastical stories which, the Freemasons write about, like Albert Pike or people like that. And you see these buildings that the Masons constructed, and a lot of people forget that Masonry was originally kind of about sacred geometry and architecture and creating these amazing buildings. Do you see any of those like kind of remnants in Masonry today in any of your experiences?
Well, it's interesting. One thing I discovered after I joined and met a lot of Masons was that the fraternity has a sort of unusual attraction for architects, contractors, electrical engineers, men who are involved in still the nitty-gritty of building. So the Masonic metaphor, the metaphor of building the ancient Temple of Solomon, is largely an allegory, a sort of teaching story that is what Masonry is organized around. It just takes those working tools of the ancient Masons, the level, the square, the plumb, and things like that, and then uses them philosophically as sort of symbols for different characteristics of psychological and ethical behavior. Whatever.
I want to just mention that we're talking to Jay Kinney here. He's the author of The Masonic Myth, a new book about Masonry. I'm curious whether, if it's the case that since it's not altogether clear what the secrets are other than these core elements, whether the stuff that you've written about in your book has already gotten you some flack within the Masonic community in terms of talking about revealing a little bit much.
So far it has not. Just about every Mason who has read it has been quite enthusiastic about it. One Mason I know who's a past Grand High Priest in the state Royal Arts chapters, he said he found it engrossing. So even people who had been involved for years seem to have discovered there are things in the book that they didn't know formally, and they've been pretty open about the book. I expect, however, at some point somebody is going to say, "Wait a minute,
right?
You shouldn't have talked about
this." That must be refreshing, just to take some of the wind out of the sails of the, these feverish conspiracy theories that swirl around this stuff. I mean, in a way, you're kind of like, it's sort of a bummer for that whole little cottage industry of paranoia, because this is a book, it's there, you're an established character. It's like they're going to have to deal with the nitty-gritty details in a way that they haven't. I'm just curious, from knowing that you've been interested in conspiracy theory as well as esotericism for a long time, for decades. And now and I'm sure you knew more about Masonry as a fantasy, and now you've seen more of it as a reality. I'm curious if you can reflect more generally on the whole role of this kind of fantasy, this kind of projection. Why do we need to fear these nefarious esoteric societies, or why do we need to believe that there are these incredibly powerful secrets buried within some distant, faceless organization? What's the social function of that stuff?
That's a good question. I think a lot of that, and there is this recurring strain of it in American history. The Masons themselves became the object of it back at the time of the William Morgan affair, which led to the anti-Masonic Party, which was the first third party in American politics. So right there, the Masons were sort of involved with that very suspicious strain in American society. But then it rolls on and has other scapegoats, as it were, whether it's immigrants or, in the case of David Icke with his theories of there are shape-shifting reptilian aliens that are, the power behind the scenes. I think when you have a society in upheaval, and America has particularly had that, it's been a very dynamic society compared particularly to a lot of other staid earlier societies. You have a lot of free-floating anxiety, and people like a single group to be able to blame for their insecurity. So one of the favorite ones over the years was the Masons, precisely because they maintained a certain kind of secrecy. I think that secrecy was totally overblown, but it was sort of part of the tradition, and Masonry's traditional, if nothing else. But in the case of, it's been mind-boggling to me that all this stuff is directed against Obama now. It's like you can't just have a president who is trying to do the best he can. It's sort of like, no, he has to be illegitimate. He has to be not really an American. He has to be a secret socialist or Nazi or something. And I just think there's a whole lot of free-floating paranoia out there that stems from the suspicion that, and it's a legitimate suspicion, that your average person really doesn't understand how things happen in the world. The world is so complex. They don't really understand economics. They don't really understand Wall Street, and I think half the people on Wall Street don't really understand it. But so you come up with simple solutions to what the problems are, and whether it's the Illuminati or the Masons or whatever. But the other thing is that I think there are a lot of little conspiracies throughout society. Now, you might not call them conspiracies in everyday life, but for instance, the whole underground economy. It's undeniable that there's a vast trade in illegal drugs. Well, how does that money move around? It's sort of like it's there beneath the surface. It's not all in cash. Some of it is going through offshore banking. And, same with gun running and illegal cigarettes being imported into Latin American countries and blah, blah, blah. There are, anywhere you look, if you dig beneath the surface, there are conspiracies going on. But what my book argues is that there's no overarching conspiracy. It's sort of like methodologically impossible to have an overarching conspiracy because there's just too many competing little groups vying for power.
That was one of the great things about it. I mean, I'm very fascinated by the institutional aspect of religion and mysticism and even esoteric groups, because it seems to me there's sort of some inherent tendencies of institutions that anybody who works with and deals with them recognizes, and they're such a fundamental part of humanity, or modern post-Neolithic humanity, is these creation of these institutions which sort of have their own kind of logic and which produce bureaucracies and sort of banal disagreements and splinter groups and hierarchies and all this kind of stuff. And that seems to be one of the things about, one of the messages about your book, the disenchanting in terms of the fantasies of messages is just that, like, any organization you're going to have. In fact, in the case of Masonry, it seems it was particularly Byzantine, that there's a lot of room for, a varieties of groups and degrees and things to develop, and then they pass away, and then somebody else reuses them over in Europe, and they do it differently in America, and they do it differently in the South, and they do it in the North, and there's different jurisdictions, and there's this, it's really kind of like a fabulous bureaucracy in some way, all of these degrees and names that you're describing. And it's, after you go through that ride, it's impossible to come out and imagine how anyone could possibly organize these people around some kind of core ideology or political intent, because anyone who deals with institutions knows that no institutions are like that. Even the ones that are attempting to be authoritarian don't really work very well. Yeah,
well, that was one of the things that intrigued me about Masonry. I mean, I always have this fascination with how do things really work? How does this ideology see the world? How does this group work in the real world? And that was one of the things I set out to do in the book was, okay, there's all these notions of Masonry as a monolithic, never-changing thing. People talk about Freemasonry as if Freemasonry in California is the same as Freemasonry in France 200 years ago, or in Latin America 100 years ago, or and what I found with my research and just poking around in the archives and whatnot is it's a myriad of Freemasonries, and there's certain shared ideals. Universal brotherhood is the main one, I would say. But beyond those shared ideals, you've got, well, in the United States alone, you have 51 Grand Lodges, one for each state and one for Washington, D.C. Those are like sovereign bodies unto themselves. Nobody from Massachusetts can go to Ohio and tell a Mason in Ohio, okay, you're going to do this, because they're under the Grand Lodge of Ohio. Then they're going to tell the guy from Massachusetts, get lost. That's not, you got your Grand Lodge, we've got our Grand Lodge. So right off the bat there, the whole notion of a overarching conspiracy in Masonry gets tossed out the window because
technical difficulty there. That must have been because we were getting too close to revealing the true secrets of Masonry.
The Masons cut the line.
Yeah, they're always going to get you. One thing about these conspiracies that also really fascinates me, and it doesn't seem like people they don't notice it as much as they should, is that there's this weird spectrum between what you could think of as realistic or political conspiracies into increasingly esoteric, occult, and ultimately completely bizarre world, mythologies. And it's not clear where the line is. So, for example, you start off with JFK. It's a political conspiracy. You're looking at the CIA. You're looking at Cuba. You're looking at MK Ultra, and you're following this Byzantine web. And then at some point along the way, some of these theorists find themselves tripping over aliens or, Men in Black, or these figures that start to appear almost as if like conspiracy theory is a kind of bridge, or can be a bridge between how we think about the real world, what actually happens, the institutions that are really running things, where the money really is going, and a bridge between that world and this world of fantasy, the world of archetypes, of dreams, is particularly a more nightmarish realm of control and manipulation. So you have someone like, whatever, David Icke, where it's like, fabulous confusion and fusion of, political conspiracies and alien, iconology. And yet it's not clear to me where the line is. And it's particularly true with something like Masonry, where on the one hand it clearly is a political organization. It clearly has played a role in politics. It clearly does draw people from power, men from power, and has done so for centuries. So there's legitimate reason to look at it as a group that is working in some ways behind the scenes, influencing things in some ways and others. And at the same time, if you look at it from the outside, you see all this bizarre these icons and the eye and the triangle and mystical symbols. So it almost captures almost more than any other organization, this weird balance between an attempt to understand the political organizations that are working behind the scenes and the fact that kind of thinking and research almost inevitably leads into mystical and occult and sort of mythological fantasies as well. It's a really remarkable part of our modern mind that we seem to do that a lot.
Yeah, well, Masonry, I think in particular, sort of lends itself to that sort of fuzzy boundary, and I think that's in part because from the beginning of modern speculative, which means philosophical Freemasonry, many of the earliest people involved were interested in and intrigued by Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, the Hermetic ideas, and this was in the 1600s in particular, into the 1700s, where it became more of an Enlightenment organization that was sort of defending the rational and human freedom and like that. But because it was sort of like on the cusp between the Renaissance with its interest in these esoteric matters and the Enlightenment with its defense of the rational, of the new scientific investigations and whatnot, it sort of has elements of both of those. And, there's not a whole lot of organizations that have continued down to the present from the day of that cusp between those two worldviews.
Well, I'd like to ask you, too, Jay, along those lines, as far as what appealed to you about Masonry, because you also kind of have a cusp of fantasy about you. I'm a big comic book fan, and I know that you were a huge figure in underground comics, and I love many of the comics that you've done, and very intelligently written comics about, some of these political, occult issues, that were brilliantly portrayed in the realm of these fantasy comics. And I just think it's so interesting that you went from doing some of those stories into like the deeper research in Gnosis and then in fact becoming involved in Freemasonry. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how your role as a comic artist helped influence you along your little trail.
Well, sure. My life, I don't know that I can explain it. I sort of get very enthusiastic about one thing and then bounce to the next thing that I'm very enthusiastic about. And there's some bigger picture to the whole thing that I can't quite see, but it must make sense. but the cartoonist, to me, the comics cartooning worldview is that of a satirist. And what does a satirist do? A satirist stands back and says, this is the contradiction between what this politician is saying or between what this group is saying they're about and the reality. And that's sort of like where humor comes from, is that gap between the pretensions and the reality, or between the image and the reality. So to me, I think, getting involved with satirical comics in the late 60s through the 70s, it led to interest in, for instance, one of the first comics that I did was called Cover Up Lowdown. That was during the era of all the revelations about the CIA in the mid-70s, and the heyday of investigative reporting. Watergate, all these things. All these things that were sort of behind the scenes were coming forward, and they were admitting, okay, we did try to assassinate Castro, we did try to do this and that. And again, my approach to working with that was a satirical one. It was sort of like, okay, let's get some of these tidbits of information out there that are being revealed, but let's do it in a humorous way because, that's the most sort of palatable way to get your point across. So to me, there's a direct line between the satirical worldview, then going into esoteric spirituality. Again, there's the notion of there's an inner spiritual reality. There's an inner aspect to the world's great religions that even those religions most of the time don't cop to, but it's sort of like the inner core of whatever is real about the religious experience. And again, to me, that's you're delving into, okay, what's the reality? And so that's what I've always sort of cleaved to. That's been my big interest, was what is really going on? What is really going on in the universe? What's really going on in political life? What's really going on with this organization or that? So in that way, I think there's a certain logic to it.
Is there something also about how images work? I mean, it seemed to me that the power that ritual has, the power that the kind of iconology of something like Masonry has partly to do with this peculiar power that images have to sort of elicit our imagination, to suggest, deeper worlds or multiple levels of meaning, to kind of engage us on a different level than our rational minds, although it's still a kind of thinking. It's not like art exactly. It's something else. It's a way that icons and images and symbols function. And I think that has something to do with comic books as well, even comic books that are about political issues or ordinary life. There's some way in which the image opens up part of the mystery that you're pointing towards.
Yeah, well, if somebody's an artist, they're familiar with a couple things. One is that if you are drawing something, there's no cut and dried interpretation of that. Everybody can look at the same image and come away with a different idea of what it means or how it impacts them. So you're dealing with a totally subjective realm, and even the artist may have their idea of what they're drawing or what they're painting, its meaning for them, but that may or may not be what anybody else is getting from it. So with my own art background, I sort of habitually looked at symbols that way. And Masonry has a zillion symbols. It's sort of like this magpie's nest of symbols that is plucked from here, there, and everywhere. And what you get is the fundamentalist worldview of fundamentalist Christians, for instance, who are very anti-Masonic. They like one single interpretation for everything. It's like literally the scripture means this, and it doesn't mean anything else. They're like blind to the possibility that symbols can mean a dozen things or can mean two contradictory things simultaneously. And, that's the realm of dreams. That's the realm of the unconscious. And part of how Masonry, I think, gets its teachings across, its explorations of human growth, of becoming a fuller human being, is with these images, with little dramas that you go through in the rituals that operate on a number of levels. There's sort of like the literal level, but there's also a symbolic level. There's a sort of subconscious level. And what that does is it has a greater impact on somebody who's experiencing those things.
Yeah, we just have a couple of minutes left, and I'd love for you to reflect a tiny bit on the future of Masonry. I mean, in some ways, I can see the way that it maintains the possibility for certain kinds of experiences and relationships and ideas that are really important to men today. But it also, in some ways, is a bit of a declining organization, and in the one that's not very 21st century in a lot of ways. How do you see its status now? Do you think it's overall in decline? Is there a sense of renovation? What's your take?
I think it's at its sort of moment of do or die. It has been losing members for the last 50 or 60 years, and it is beginning to turn itself around. I mean, it has no choice, and there are a lot of younger men who are being attracted to it. They're sort of flocking in, I think partly attracted by things like National Treasure and now Dan Brown's book. But, I think it has the capability to once again be vital and turn itself around, but it's going to be a challenge. It's not easy, and there's a lot of institutional inertia that is going to have to be overcome, and new ways of doing things are going to have to be invented, and they are beginning to be invented. So I'm hopeful for the future. I think it still has a role to play in society. I think it provides an important initiation for men, sort of initiation into mature masculinity. But we will see. It's still up in the air.
Great. Well, Jay, thanks so much for being here. Yes, we were talking to Jay Kinney, author of The Masonic Myth, a terrific new book on Masonry, unlocking the truth about the symbols, secret rites, and history of Masonry, and he's also the co-author of Hidden Wisdom, A Guide to the Western Inner Traditions. And I really want to thank you again for writing this great book. I'm Erik Davis, and you can check out some of my stuff on www.techgnosis.com. And I also wanted to mention that our co-host here on Expanding Mind, the lovely Maja Daou, will be leading a tour of esoteric sites in Los Angeles, I believe on Halloween. Isn't that right, Maja?
That's right, Erik. It's going to be pretty spooky.
Where are you going?
We're going to go to an OTO lodge. We're going to go to the Gnostic Society of Dr. Stephan Heller, who I believe contributed to Gnosis to your
Yeah, he was one of our regular writers.
Yeah, he's fantastic. And then we'll also be going to the Theosophical Lodge, which is downtown on Grand and 33rd, very Masonic number.
Very funny. So
yeah, and you can go on esotouric.com, has all the info for that.
That's E-S-O-U-T. How do you spell that?
E-S-O-T-O-U-R-I-C, Esotouric.
Excellent. Yeah, and I've done a couple of tours with them, too, and hopefully do another one. So, well, folks, thanks a lot, and you've been listening to Expanding Mind. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but they're installing a new phone system, and next week, who are we talking to next week? Do you remember, Masha? I should know this. I'm the host, but I can't. Who are we talking to? It's somebody really interesting. Well, I'm going to have to tune in later. All right, thank you.